My therapist asked me a question 3 years ago that I have not been able to stop thinking about since. She asked me to describe the way I talk to myself when I make a mistake, and I did, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Would you ever speak to another person that way?" My name is Judith. I'm 78 years old, and the answer to that question was no, I would not. And the no, arriving in that quiet office on that ordinary Tuesday afternoon, was the beginning of the most significant reckoning of my life, which is saying something for a woman of 78 who has had no shortage of things to reckon with. I want to tell you the whole story, because the whole story is the only honest version, and because I think the partial version, the version that is simply about a woman who is too hard on herself and eventually learned to be kinder, is not useful to anyone. The useful version is the specific one, the one that accounts for where the harshness came from and what it did and what it cost and what, finally, and at 78, happened when I stopped doing it long enough to understand what I had been doing and to whom. I grew up in Minneapolis in the 1950s and 1960s, the oldest daughter of 4 children, in a family that was organized around the particular values of a certain kind of mid-century Midwestern household, which is to say, it was organized around competence and propriety and the understanding that the measure of a person was in what they produced and how they conducted themselves, and whether the gap between their actual performance and the standard expected of them was acceptable or required further effort. Not a cold family. I want to say that my parents loved us and said so, but a family in which love and expectation were so thoroughly entangled that I did not learn to separate them until very late in my life. And the entanglement produced in me, from an early age, a monitoring system, an internal auditor of my own behavior and output and presentation that ran continuously, and that held me to a standard that was, I understand now, but did not understand then, not reasonable. My mother was an exceptional woman by any measure available to me, and I mean that with the full complexity that exceptional implies when applied to a parent. She was intelligent and capable and organized, and held herself to standards of conduct and performance that she met with a consistency that I found, growing up, both impressive and slightly exhausting, because the consistency communicated something beyond its own content, communicated by its unbroken quality that the standard was achievable, was expected, was the baseline rather than the achievement. She was not critical of me in any overt or cruel way. She praised my accomplishments with a warmth that was genuine and that I valued and needed. But the praise was proportional to the accomplishment, and the accomplishment was measured against a standard that moved upward as I moved toward it. And what I learned from that, not as a lesson, but as the texture of daily life absorbed over years, was that the appropriate response to doing well was to identify the next thing that needed to be done better. I became very early my mother's most efficient student. The internal auditor I developed did not require her to point out my failures, because I was pointing them out faster and more thoroughly than she would have. By the time I was 12 or 13, I had internalized the monitoring so completely that it operated automatically, running in the background of everything I did, assessing and finding wanting and generating the next standard before the current one had been fully met. I understood this as diligence. I understood it as the appropriate relationship between a capable person and the full extent of their capability. I did not understand it as harshness, because harshness was something you directed at other people, and this was something I was directing at myself, which felt like self-discipline rather than self-harm. I was an excellent student. I graduated near the top of my class, attended the University of Minnesota on a full scholarship, studied psychology, which I chose because the interior life of people genuinely fascinated me, and because I wanted to understand, in a framework that was systematic and credentialed, why people were the way they were, which was a question I had been asking informally since I was a child, watching the people around me with the slightly too close attention of someone who is trying to figure out how to navigate them successfully. I graduated, completed a master's degree, and became a social worker, which felt like the most direct application of what I cared about, and which I did for 35 years with a commitment and a quality of attention that I was, by external measures, very good at. I was good at my work in a way that I want to examine carefully, because the goodness at it was real, and was also, I understand now, part of the same system that was making me hard on myself. I was good at my work because I held myself to standards in it that would not permit less than very good. When a case went badly, when I felt I had missed something or misjudged something or failed a client in some way that might have been avoided, I did not process it the way I would have advised any of my clients to process a professional failure, with honest assessment and appropriate self-compassion and the extraction of whatever lesson was available before moving forward. I processed it by staying with it longer than was useful, by going over it more thoroughly than was necessary, by holding myself in a kind of internal court that had no acquittals, only verdicts of guilty with varying sentences, and the sentences were always some form of do better, which meant be more, which meant the standard had moved again, and the gap between where I was and where I needed to be had been recalculated and found, as it was always found, insufficient. I married a man named Robert in 1971. Robert was a kind man, a genuinely kind man, which was the quality I valued most in him, and which was also, I understand now, the quality I was most unable to receive from him in the way he intended to give it. He was generous with his approval and his affection and his assessment of who I was and what I was capable of, and I received his generosity the way you receive something in a currency you cannot quite spend, acknowledging it, even appreciating it in some abstract sense, without being able to actually use it, because the internal auditor had a much lower opinion of my worth than Robert did, and the internal auditor's opinion was the one I trusted. This is the part of the story that costs me the most to tell, not because it involves dramatic events, but because it involves the quiet and consistent undoing of something that deserved to be kept intact, which was the tenderness that Robert offered me from the first years of our marriage, and that I was, across the decades of it, unable to fully accept. He told me I was wonderful, regularly and specifically, and with the sincerity of a man who meant what he said, and I deflected it, not with cruelty, not in a way that was visible as rejection, but with the small and practiced deflections of someone who has learned to receive compliments gracefully while not actually allowing them to land. Thank you, what was my characteristic response to anything Robert offered in the way of praise or affirmation. And the but was always the beginning of the internal auditor's counter-assessment, the enumeration of the ways in which the praise was in excess of the evidence, the ways in which I had not done as well as he was suggesting, the ways in which his generous perception of me was a product of his love rather than an accurate assessment of my actual performance. Robert was patient with this for a long time. He was patient with it the way that people who love someone are patient with the things in that person that push them away, with the hope and the consistent effort that love produces, returning again and again to the offering, the affirmation, the genuine and warmly meant assessment of who I was, trying to find the form in which it would finally be received. And I deflected it again and again, not because I did not want it, but because something in me could not hold it, could not reconcile the person he was describing with the person the internal auditor was maintaining. And the internal auditor had been in operation since I was 12 years old and had 30 years of seniority over Robert's 3 and seniority 1. We had 2 children, a daughter named Sarah in 1975 and a son named Michael in 1978. I love them with a fierceness that I think is the most uncomplicated thing I can say about myself across my entire adult life. Loved them with a completeness and a commitment that did not come naturally in some other areas of my emotional life, but that was simply available from the beginning with them. The specific and bottomless love of a parent for a child that requires no maintenance and no justification and no reconciliation with any internal standard. I was a good mother to them in the ways that I was capable of being a good mother, present and attentive and committed to their development with a thoroughness that reflected the same quality I brought to my professional work. And I was also, I have come to understand, a model of something I would not have chosen to model, which was the relationship between a capable person and their own insufficiency. Sarah told me something when she was in her 30s that I carried for years without fully understanding what to do with it. She said, "Mom, when I was growing up, I never once heard you say that you were proud of yourself. I heard you say you were proud of me, and that meant the world to me. But I never heard you direct it at yourself, and I think I absorbed something from that. And I have spent a lot of my adult life trying to figure out what it was I absorbed." She said it not with accusation, but with the directness of a woman who had done enough of her own work to be able to name things clearly. And I told her I would think about it, which was what I said when I received things I was not ready to sit with directly. And I did think about it, and the thinking produced the familiar audit, the assessment of where I had failed as a mother, and what it had produced in my daughter, and how the failure might have been corrected. If I had understood it sooner, which was not what Sarah had been asking me to do with what she told me, and which was, in its way, the exact demonstration of the things she had described. Robert and I were married for 31 years, until his death in 2002. He died from a sudden cardiac event at 58 years old, which is an age that seems younger to me every year I move further past it. And the loss of him was the largest single loss of my life, and also, in its way, the clearest mirror I had yet been offered of what I had done with what he had tried to give me. After he died, I went through his belongings with the methodical attention of someone who is using the practical task to stay inside the boundary of what she can manage, and in his desk I found a journal that he had kept not consistently, but in the intermittent way that some people journal, returning to it in the significant moments rather than the daily ones. I did not read all of it. Some of it felt private in a way that I wanted to honor. But I read the sections that had my name in them, and what I found, there was a portrait of a man who had loved his wife for 30 years, and who had spent significant portions of those years in a gentle and frustrated bewilderment about her inability to receive what he was offering. He wrote about the deflections. He had a name for them. In the journal, he called it the yes but, which was not wrong. And he wrote about how he had tried, across 30 years of trying, to find the form of the offering that would get past the yes but, and about the occasional moments when something had gotten through, when I had accepted something he said, or felt something warm and undefeated in my presence with him, and what those moments had felt like, which he described as a relief, as the feeling of finally reaching the person he had married and who was. He wrote in there, genuinely in there, underneath the monitoring and the self-assessment and the perpetual inadequacy verdict, a woman of warmth and humor and a capacity for tenderness that he had seen clearly from the beginning, and that he had spent 30 years trying to give permission to come forward. I sat on the floor of his study and read those pages, and I cried in a way I had not cried since the funeral, not from grief only, but from the specific and terrible recognition of what he was describing, the recognition of the yes, but from the outside, from the point of view of the person who had been on the receiving end of it for 30 years, and what it had looked like from there, and what it had cost him, and what, by extension, it had cost me and us, and the 30 years we had had together that might have had a different quality if I had been able to do the thing I did not know how to do, which was to simply accept what was being given without immediately holding it up to the internal auditor's light and finding it in excess of what I deserved. I continued my professional life after Robert's death with the same commitment and the same quality of work that had characterized it before. And in the years immediately following his death, I was, if anything, harder on myself than I had been before, which is saying something, because the grief had no other direction, and the internal auditor had no competition from Robert's patient and consistent counter-assessments. I worked longer hours and held myself to tighter standards and produced more and volunteered more, and was, by every external measure available, a model of a woman who was coping admirably, and I was also, by the interior measure that I was only slowly becoming able to take, A woman who was using the work and the performance and the ceaseless forward production as an alternative to sitting with the questions that Robert's journal had opened and that I was not ready to answer. I retired from social work at 68, which was later than most of my colleagues, and the retirement produced the same disorientation that retirement produces for people who have organized their identity around their professional performance, which is to say, it produced the removal of the primary arena in which the internal auditor had been operating and the sudden uncomfortable quiet of an interior life that was accustomed to managing itself through productivity, and that had, without the productivity, nothing left to manage itself with except itself. The quiet was instructive. Not immediately, not comfortably, but instructive in the way that things are instructive when there is no longer any noise available to cover them. I began, in the first years of retirement, to hear the internal auditor more clearly than I had heard it when it was always operating in the background of a full and busy professional life, because it had less competition, and what I heard, clearly and without the ambient noise of work to soften it, was the thing that had been running inside me since I was 12 years old, and it was not, in the clarity of that quiet, what I had understood it to be. I had understood it, for 66 years, as the voice of high standards, as the appropriate internal response of a capable person to their own output, as the mechanism by which good work was maintained and improvement was possible. What I heard in the retirement quiet, without the work to validate it, without the professional achievement to justify it, without anything to measure except the bare fact of my own daily existence, was something different. I heard a voice that was telling me, with the consistency and the persistence of something that had been running uninterrupted for 6 decades, that I was not enough. Not my work, not my performance, not my output, me, not enough in myself, not sufficient as I was, always requiring more effort and more correction and more management before I would be acceptable. And the acceptable was a horizon that moved as I moved toward it, and that I was never going to reach, because the voice did not have a version of me that was enough, had never had one, had been operating on the assumption that enough was a destination rather than a condition, and that the distance to it would always require exactly the effort currently being expended. I began therapy at 75, not because of a crisis, not because something had broken down in a way that required intervention, but because I had been sitting in the retirement quiet for 7 years, and I had arrived, slowly and through the accumulation of evidence that the quiet made available, at the understanding that something in me had been running for 63 years on an assumption that was not accurate, and that I did not know how to change an assumption that old by myself, and that this was actually the kind of thing that therapy was for. I say this not as a recommendation, though I would recommend it, but as the honest account of a 75-year-old woman who had spent 35 years working as a social worker and advising clients to seek the help they needed, and who had spent the same 35 years not applying that advice to herself, which was itself a demonstration of the thing I am describing, the thing where other people deserve the help and the grace and the care that I did not think to extend to myself. My therapist's name is Dr. Patricia Chun, and she is 20 years younger than me, which I mention because I had a prejudice about it before we began that I want to acknowledge. The assumption that someone 20 years my junior would not have access to the experience my situation required, which was a form of the internal auditor finding a new subject and turned out to be entirely wrong. She listened to me in the first sessions with a quality of attention that I recognized from my own professional practice and that I felt, from the receiving end of it, differently than I had understood it from the giving end, felt it as a form of care that was not conditional on what I produced in the session or whether I was a good enough client, or whether my problems were worth the attention being given to them. She asked me, in our third session, to describe a recent mistake I had made, something ordinary, and then to describe what had happened inside me afterward. I described a minor error in judgment, something I had said to a friend that I had immediately understood was careless and that I had apologized for. And then I described what had happened inside me after the apology, which was that the audit had continued for several days, revisiting the error and the apology and the insufficiency of both, and the pattern it was evidence of, and the conclusion that pattern supported about the fundamental quality of my character, as expressed in my relationships, which was a significant amount of interior activity generated by a small and resolved social misstep. She listened to all of that, and then she asked me her question. Would you ever speak to another person that way? And the no arrived immediately, arrived before I had finished hearing the question, arrived with the certainty of something that required no consideration, because the answer was obvious, because I would not in 1,000 years apply to another person the sustained and merciless assessment I had just described applying to myself over a minor error that had been acknowledged and apologized for and forgiven by the person it had affected. I would not do that to another person, because it would be unkind, because it would be disproportionate, because it would cause harm that the situation did not warrant and that the person receiving it did not deserve. She let the no sit for a moment, and then she asked me why I thought I was different. I did not have an answer. What I had, instead, was the beginning of the understanding that has been growing for 3 years since, and that I am trying to tell you about, which is that I had never, across 75 years of extending grace and patience and compassionate assessment to every person in my professional and personal life who needed it, applied any of those things to myself, and that the non-application had not been a product of humility, as I had understood it, but of something that functioned more like a rule, an early and unexamined conviction that I was not among the category of people to whom grace applied, that I was the exception to my own standard of care, that the voice running inside me since I was 12 was an accurate and appropriate voice, rather than a voice that was doing to me what I would have recognized immediately as harmful if I had heard it directed at anyone else. The work of the next 3 years, the work I am still doing, has been the work of questioning that conviction, which is harder than it sounds because a conviction installed at 12 and running, uninterrupted for 63 years, has the quality of structural truth rather than of an assumption that can be examined and revised. It does not feel like a belief that can be changed. It feels like the floor, and examining the floor requires a willingness to consider that you might have been standing on something that was not as solid as it felt, which produces, understandably, a certain reluctance. But I examined it. With Dr. Chun's consistent and patient help, I examined it, and what I found when I looked at the foundation of the conviction was not the solid and reasonable structure I expected to find, but something much more contingent and much more traceable. The formation of a 12-year-old girl in a household that entangled love and performance so completely that the girl had concluded, reasonably from her available evidence, that love was conditional on performance, and that the internal auditor was the mechanism by which performance was kept at a level that maintained the love. The auditor had been, at 12, a survival strategy. It had been the tool by which a child who understood love as contingent ensured that the contingency was met. And it had kept running, past the childhood and past the household that created it, and past every piece of evidence that might have revised it. Kept running because that is what early installations do, because the operating system does not update itself, because a 12-year-old solution to a 12-year-old's problem does not automatically dissolve when the problem changes, or when the person grows up and out of the conditions that made the solution necessary. Sarah came to visit me about a year into the therapy, and we had a conversation that I want to describe because it is, for me, one of the clearest markers of what was changing and at what cost, and what, alongside the cost, was being found. She asked me how I was, in the genuine way rather than the social way, and I told her, actually told her, about the therapy and about what was being examined and about what I was discovering about the auditor and where it had come from and what it had done across 66 years of continuous operation. She listened to all of it with the focused attention that she had had since she was a child. And when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Mom, I always thought the hardest thing in the world would be to tell you that you had done something wrong, because it seemed like you were already ahead of me, already doing it to yourself worse than I could ever do it. And it made me not want to pile on, and it also made me feel sometimes like there was no room for my hurt, because yours was bigger and pre-existing and self-inflicted. I had not understood that. I had not understood that the internal auditor had this outward effect, that its operation was visible to the people around me, and that its visibility had shaped how those people related to me, had made certain kinds of honesty feel unavailable to them, because I had already occupied the position of harshest critic, and there was nowhere for them to stand inside that. Sarah had not told me when I hurt her, sometimes because my self-punishment had been comprehensive enough to make her feel that adding her own would be cruel rather than appropriate. And the result was that she had carried things alone that she should have been able to bring to me. And our relationship had been, in those unspoken things, less than it could have been. I sat with that for a long time. I am still sitting with it. The understanding that the harshness was not only an interior event, was not only something happening in the privacy of my own assessment of myself, but was a broadcast, was something the people who loved me were receiving and responding to and organizing their own behavior around, was new and important and humbling in the specific way that humbling works when it comes not from external criticism, but from internal understanding, from seeing something clearly that you have been not seeing for a very long time. I have been trying for 3 years to extend to myself the same grace I have always extended to others. I want to describe what that has actually looked like in practice, because I think the theoretical description of self-compassion is considerably more available than the practical description. And the practical description is what is useful to people who are where I was, which is in possession of the theoretical understanding and without much working knowledge of what the practice actually entails when you are 75 or 76 or 78 years old, and the auditor has been running for 63 years and has no intention of stopping just because you have decided at this late date that you would prefer it to. What it looked like at first was simply noticing when the audit began, noticing the voice and its quality and what it was saying and how long it ran after the event that triggered it, and whether the duration and the intensity were proportional to anything that had actually happened. Just noticing, without trying to change anything, because Dr. Chun was clear that the first step was observation rather than intervention. That trying to stop the auditor before you had fully seen, it was like trying to fix something before you had understood what it was, and that the seeing was itself the first form of the change. The noticing was harder than it sounds, because what I was trying to notice was something I had been doing automatically for 63 years, which meant it had the quality of invisibility that habitual things have, the quality of being the water you are swimming in, rather than a thing you are swimming alongside. But I practiced it with the consistency I had always applied to things I was committed to, and gradually, across several months, the noticing became more reliable, and with the noticing came a quality of distance from the auditor that I had not previously had, the distance of an observer rather than a participant, and from that distance, the auditor different than it had from inside it. From inside it, the auditor had always felt like truth. From the outside of it, from the observer's distance that the noticing produced, it looked like a frightened child, a 12-year-old girl maintaining the only mechanism she had for keeping the thing she needed most from being taken away, running the mechanism 66 years past the conditions that had required it, in a world that had changed completely, and in a life that had provided, repeatedly and in various forms, the evidence that the love was not contingent on the performance, and that the mechanism was no longer necessary, and had perhaps never been as necessary as the 12-year-old had believed. I began, slowly and with a tentativeness that I found both appropriate and slightly frustrating in the way that slow things frustrate someone who has always moved efficiently, to talk back to it, not to argue with it, because arguing with an internal voice that has had 66 years to prepare its case is not a winning strategy, but to add something alongside what it was saying, to introduce a counter voice that was not the opposite of the auditor, but was simply a different perspective. A voice that asked the question Dr. Chon had asked, "Would you say this to someone else?" And that, when the answer was no, said something quieter and less insistent but real. Something that tried to offer to me what I had spent 35 years offering to my clients, which was the acknowledgement that difficulty is not the same as failure, that mistakes are not the same as unworthiness, that the gap between your performance and the highest possible standard is not a verdict on your value as a person. I want to tell you what this has produced that is visible from the outside, because I think the interior account is useful, and I also think the exterior account matters, because the harshness was not only interior, and the softening of it has not only been interior either. Sarah and I are closer than we have been in her adult life, not because anything dramatic has changed between us, but because something in the atmosphere of my presence with her has changed, something that she has named in our recent conversations as the feeling that there is room now, that I am not already occupying every critical position and leaving her nowhere to stand when she has something difficult to bring to me. She brought something difficult to me 6 months ago, something about a way I'd handled a situation with her daughter that had hurt her, and she brought it directly and without the careful management of previous years. And I received it without the audit beginning immediately, received it as her experience of something real, held it without converting it into a verdict, and said I was sorry with the simplicity that genuine apology has when it is not contaminated by the machinery of self-punishment. She cried, not from the apology, or not only from the apology, but from the experience of bringing something to me and having it received without the yes but, without the preemptive self-flagellation that had always made her hurt feel like a complication of mine rather than something that deserved its own space. She said, "This is what I always wanted," and I understood what she meant, which was not the apology specifically, but the condition of my presence in which the apology was possible, the condition of a mother who was available to her daughter's hurt, rather than already occupied with her own. I think about Robert often. I think about the journal and the yes, but and the 30 years of his patient offering, and my consistent inability to receive it. And I carry that with grief that I have learned to hold without making it an occasion for the audit, because the grief is appropriate and the audit is not what the grief needs. What I have come to understand, holding both the grief and the new knowledge, is that what I could not give to Robert, what the auditor prevented me from giving him, was not the love, which was real and enormous, and which he knew. He wrote clearly in the journal that he knew, but the softness that receiving his love would have required, the willingness to be someone who was enough to deserve what he was offering, and that the inability to be that person was not a character flaw, but a formation, an installation, and that the formation was not my fault in any simple sense, even though its consequences were real and are mine to carry. I am 78 years old, and I am learning at 78 something that I believe should be taught much earlier, and that I do not know how to. Ensure is taught earlier, except by being honest about its cost when it is not. I am learning that the grace that I extended to every person I worked with and loved and cared for across 78 years of a full and effortful life was available to me all along, was mine to take as well as mine to give, and that the taking of it was not selfishness, and was not the lowering of standards, and was not the abandonment of the capacity for improvement that I had been confusing it with for 6 decades. It was simply the acknowledgement that I was also a person, that the category of people who deserved care and patience and the benefit of the doubt in their own assessment of their own worth was not a category from which I was correctly excluded, and that the exclusion had been a mistake, a very old and very expensive mistake that I was finally imperfectly, and with the help of a therapist 20 years my junior, in the process of correcting. If you hear something of yourself in what I am describing, I am not going to tell you what to do with the hearing, because what to do with it is a question that belongs to you and your specific circumstances, and your specific formation, and the specific shape of the harshness you may have been running inside yourself since, whenever yours was installed. What I will tell you is that the question Dr. Chon asked me is worth asking yourself, and that if the answer is no, if you would not speak to another person the way you speak to yourself, then the no is information, and the information is that there is a discrepancy between the standard of care you apply outward and the standard you apply inward, and that the discrepancy has a cost, and that the cost is not abstract and is not only borne by you. The people who love you are receiving the broadcast. They are organizing their behavior around it, protecting you from additional burden by not bringing you their hurt, or protecting themselves from the experience of watching you turn their love into evidence of your inadequacy, or learning from the example you provide their own versions of the relationship between performance and worth that you are modeling every day, whether you mean to or not. The harshness is not private. It has never been private. It lives in the atmosphere of your presence, the way all interior conditions eventually live in the atmosphere of a person's presence, and the people you love have been breathing it for as long as you have been generating it. You can decide to generate something else. Not immediately, not completely, not without the work that changing a 60-year installation requires. But you can decide to begin, which is what I decided at 75. And the beginning, however late, has produced things I did not have before it, and that I would not trade for the performance of the internal auditor, which produced nothing that those things can be weighed against. Sarah called me last week on a Tuesday evening, for no particular reason, just to talk. We talked for an hour about ordinary things, her children and her work, and something she had been reading, and at the end she said, "I like talking to you, Mom." And she said it the way you say something when you mean exactly what you are saying, and nothing more or less. And I said, "I like talking to you too," and I meant it, and I received it. And for the length of that phone call, and for some time after it, the auditor was quiet. And in the quiet, I was simply there, simply myself, simply a woman of 78 on the phone with her daughter on a Tuesday evening. Enough for the conversation, enough for the moment, enough. That is what I wanted to tell you. Not that I have solved anything, because I have not, and not that the auditor has stopped, because it has not, but that the quiet exists, and that the quiet is available, and that inside the quiet there is a person who has always been there, who was there underneath the monitoring and the standards and the 66 years of self-directed harshness, a person who can receive a Tuesday evening phone call and be, simply and without audit, glad